Dr. Jason Swan Clark. This is a long-anticipated interview. Your research on evangelicalism and capitalism is going to feature quite heavily, and we hope this is going to be the first interview in a series. And after this one, you're going to take the helm. But this is just an introduction, really, to basically your life and also your ministry as a pastor of a church, but also your interest in, I guess, what we would say is the good life and how that should be interpreted or can be interpreted from a Christian point of view, with particular relevance to capitalism and its effects on how we live. Now, my grown-up kids have actually pointed out to me that there is an American comedian called Bill Hader who does this character called Keith Morrison on the Saturday Night Live, and he tends to interview real people in difficult or bad situations. So when we talk about your childhood, and he tends to get a little bit excited about it, a little too interested, I'm definitely going to try and be quite calm. I know about your childhood, and I think we could agree actually that it is a fairly difficult childhood. So if I do appear to be either with our black sense of humour, slightly lacking in empathy, it's because we've known each other a long time. But it is a very difficult childhood, and of course it's very instrumental really in how you've developed. So could we perhaps start then with just talking about where you grew up?
So I grew up in Luton, north of London, or as we say, was dragged up in Luton, on various council estates around there until, all the way through till age 19, and then left and haven't been back since.
And your parents, what did they do?
My father was, he was an engineer for the old GPO, you might remember that, before it became British Telecom. And he did various things. He worked for TV detector vans as well, which I always thought must be exciting. I imagine him tracking people down and arresting them, but it wasn't. It was just sending details off to report that their TVs were on. And then he did much to his chagrin, my mother forced him to do, he was a very bright guy. He went to grammar school, but left school at 16. And he later in life went and did a couple of diplomas or something in electronics and got some pretty well-paid jobs. I mean, it was disastrous in the long run because it ruined his life and ours. And went to work in the Middle East making lots of money. So he was an electrical engineer, good at maths in a way that I wasn't. And my mother had a variety of jobs. She was a dental, I guess you'd call it, would it be a technician? Someone that helped the dentist back in the day. And then she was a hotel bar manager and other kinds of jobs. I mean, my parents were of a generation. I remember they used to list all the different jobs they did. And how can someone have so many jobs? And I do remember my dad saying to me, that things would be different for my generation, because this was and that conversation was probably in the late 1970s, and Margaret Thatcher was coming in, and there was all the unrest and everything that was happening back then in the late 70s. And he was saying how things were much different when he was younger. You could easily move around between jobs and pay the bills, but he told me a different future was coming in which flexibility to move around work and secure jobs would be harder to get. But that's what I remember them doing.
Okay, so when were you actually born?
When?
31st
of January 1969.
So it's Apollo, isn't it? The moon landings?
Yes, good year, 69 was, the moon landings and Concorde. Concorde maiden flight was that year,
So you were living in Luton, which is kind of about 30 miles northwest of London, isn't it?
It's due north of London, straight up the M1, and it's actually nearer than that. It's only about 15, 20 miles. It's not too far. It's not very far at all.
And was it one of those kind of new towns, Luton?
Yes and no. There was this will be the boring bit. There were two parts to the original town: High Town and Low Town, as they were called, and it was one of those places. And one of the things in its history as it developed was milliners, so producing hats. Yeah. So that's why the football team were called the Hatters. Okay. And there's lots of references still to pubs, the Hatters and stuff around the place. So very working class, even before the Second World War. And then there was High Town and Low Town, and of course one of those that you get that in a lot of places. Low Town people mangled it and it turned into Luton, and the High Town merged with the town. But really it was after the Second World War, Luton exploded with growth. So Whitbread were there, Electrolux were there, Skefco, engineering company, Vauxhall. So it was this working class metropolis. Really? After the Second World War, loads of council housing and property built as a result of this, with all these jobs, and then huge migration to the area. So my father's grandparents, my grandparents moved there after the Second World War with pretty much all of their siblings. And I found out that my grandfather had about, I think 12 or 13 different siblings. And they all moved there for work. And these were people that had moved, they were from Newcastle. All right. So it had all been colliers, worked in coal mining, and had a pretty rough life. And there was this mass migration to Luton. I mean, I guess, I don't know the population figures, but they must have transformed massively. So there's bits of it that are old, but it's a new town in some ways because it's post-Second World War development.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of movement, I think, wasn't there, around that time? Corby, which was, I think, associated with steel, further north. Yeah. A lot of Scots moved there. So people were coming down from Yorkshire, Newcastle, who'd been miners, some of them?
Yes, so lots.
To Luton. And
it's interesting. I've been doing my family tree and found on both sides of my family, my mother's side and my father's side, is this shared, I didn't realise it, from grandparents and great-grandparents, parents above, all come from that area. And they were all working class people in the coal mining, or stevedores shoveling coal off of boats and stuff. And they all made this migration down to Luton. And then Dunstable was another town that grew near it, and there's Leighton Buzzard nearby and all these other sorts of places. But that's where the migration was from, a big migration from that area.
So what was the population of Luton like? I mean, post-war, there's also a lot of immigration, isn't there? And people are moving to where there are, skilled manual jobs. Was there a lot of immigration into Luton as well?
Huge amounts. So not just migration of white working class people. Again, this is only anecdotal. I've not looked at research of my childhood memories. So the different places that I lived, one of the council areas that we moved to, was actually, we moved under right to buy and bought a property. So some council properties that, so that people were able to buy. And there was a black Afro-Caribbean population, probably on a par with Brixton. I mean, that's the memory you have as a kid. And I remember the shops and I remember the food. But that quickly evaporated during my early childhood, and there was this increase in Asian community, Pakistani, Bangladeshi in particular. One of the places that I lived moved in, and I don't know if to say displaced, but as they moved in, it became the second mosque in the UK was actually, there was this population grew so quickly. The second mosque, it was built just around the corner from where I lived, because the original mosque, the first mosque in the UK was Regent's Park, I think. Nice. And I'm pretty sure the second mosque that was built was in Luton because of this Asian community. So during my early childhood, saw the growth of it, and through what was called Bury Park, near where I lived at one point, past the football, was this area that just spread and got bigger and bigger and bigger as this Asian community moved into it. And then so one of my junior schools I was in at that point, I think there were two of us were white. Wow. In the class, so you had this dynamic of parts of where we lived were very white and working class, and then other parts that were, incredibly mixed, multiculturally and racially. So we had riots when there were. Do you remember the Brixton riots back in whenever that was, early 80s or something? 80s, yeah. We had twin riots in. I remember getting a clip round the ear for looking out the window at things being set light to or blown up that I could see down the road. So Yeah, it
Luton,
was a real
Luton
mix.
riots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the whole Bollywood thing, you know, I mean, it was a really fascinating place to grow up as a kid. My friends, until I went to high school, when I moved the other side of town, go around their houses, you know, and there'd be all these religious shrines, you know, depending on their different religious affiliations. There would just be these colourful religious shrines, and you know, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And always the smell of curry as I grew up as a kid.
Gosh.
And one of the ironies is my parents were so Anglo-Saxon, we never ate spicy food, ever.
Right.
First time I had a curry was when I left Luton. It's hard to believe because there are so many curry houses there. And I went to Northwood, which is like one of the Jewish capital spots of the UK, and I had my first curry there. And friends said, well, you're from Luton, have you never had a curry? I mean, you know that juxtaposition of not engaging in the culture that you live in.
Yeah.
Because of this food that my parents always warned me about was far too spicy, you know, you can't have anything.
And yet you were in the houses as a child.
Yeah, as a child.
And
I remember the difference, the textures of those families.
Wow.
I mean, didn't understand a word they were saying. And, but were colourful, smells, was a real... And then I moved high school to the other side of town. It was one of these new secondary moderns.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have secondary modern schools anymore.
I don't think we do.
Don't know.
We have some grammar schools in certain areas, but I'm not sure we have secondary moderns
And
anymore.
that was a massive change for me to move there, because I came home and I do remember my mum saying, what was it like? Apart from it was huge. Yeah. I said, everyone's white. I remember that shock.
It's extraordinary. Yeah. So, and that's at secondary school. So your early life is really in a multiracial environment.
So very white working class when I was younger, and then moving to an environment, Black Afro-Caribbean, and then a very strong Asian community, and then moving to an area that again was very white. That's one of those.
Can we talk a bit more then about your parents, and particularly your mother?
Yes.
Because, I mean, we've talked before, haven't she? You wouldn't describe her perhaps as an easy person, really, in some ways.
When I'm being kind, I describe my mother as one of the most difficult human beings you could ever meet. Yeah. For my brother and I mean, it's gallows humour. We do get together and say, do you remember that time when Mum beat you senseless? Or... Gosh. And you know, and that's common. Lots of kids do that when they grow up. They, with siblings, will laugh about things that at the time were incredibly traumatic. Yeah. I'm pretty sure, with hindsight, my mother probably had some sort of major personality disorder, probably bipolar, rapid cycling hypomanic. I mean, one minute she would be on top of the world, the next minute she would be destroying everyone and everything else around you. I mean, all the so maybe those. And a few other things, deeply troubled. I think the kind of thing that, if she'd been in a different generation, would be picked up at school, but just wasn't. Yeah. And had an ability to destroy every relationship around her. And I so as a kid, we grew up with a lot of physical, emotional, mental, and even some sexual abuse. And I remember my father sort of being this henpecked, bullied person. Yeah. She terrified him in some ways, terrified us, and terrified our family. And that's one of the reasons we got so isolated, was not just that environment, but the rest of our family were. I mean, one of the stories, you want to hear one of the stories? Yeah. This is being recorded. I was talking with my brother the other day about this. We call it the potato incident. So I just learned about surface area in school. Yeah. And my mother asked me to chop up the potatoes. And I would peel them and cut them up and boil them, you know, nice family thing to do. And of course it goes to my, I've just learned about surface area. And I'm like, well, my mother usually just cuts them in big chunks. If I cut these into small pieces, they'll boil quicker. So try this science experiment, chop them up, put them in. And when I finish, she looks in and she says, what have you done? I mean, I'll edit what I say, because every other word would have been, what the have you done, you stupid little... And I tried explaining surface area. My mum was not someone to explain surface area to.
Wrong time,
wrong place, wrong person. I was laughing when it resulted in her throwing the contents of the pan at me, beating me with the saucepan till I was black and blue, and having to run out. One of the worst beatings of my life. And I remember not just I remember I was so incensed as a kid it wasn't that because I probably got used to the beatings. It was the fact that I couldn't get her to even comprehend for 1 minute what I was trying to explain to her.
She wouldn't listen to the surface area.
No, it was bloody awful.
Do you know why? What triggered that?
With
what
my
had you
mother,
done to the potatoes?
My mother was good in some ways. She wanted, and this is, I've come across this with other people from working class backgrounds. She wanted a better life for me. I ended up playing in a national youth orchestra, ended up going to this high school the other side of town. There were things that she aspired to for me that were very important in my life, because she wanted that. She could see I was bright, and in some ways knew that the environment we were in, I mean, the high school that I should have gone to eventually was closed because of so much drugs and violence there. It was an awful, and even she knew, if I go there, this will destroy me. So she could see that, but then she absolutely resented anything good in my life. And that happens a lot with people from working class backgrounds. Their parents want more for them, but they often resent when good things come to them.
And this is interesting from a political point of view, because you mentioned Margaret Thatcher already.
Yeah.
And there are still people who think that 1979 was the big turning point, in post-war British society. Yeah. You would have been about 10.
Yep.
And you have an aspirational mother.
Yeah.
Who at the same time is anti-aspirational when you actually express it, which must be very troubling for you.
It is.
But what effect did Thatcherism have on you as a family and you personally? Good and bad?
I would say that Thatcherism for me was very beneficial. My parents were able to buy a home in a way that they never would have been able to under right for buy. This is what I remember. I mean, their ability to look after their money and steward that is another issue. That was their own stupid fault, and they managed to destroy everything in their lives. But education, I mean, that was, the ability to choose a high, that came in at the time. So, and I remember my mother pressing into that, and I saw their head of education for their local borough. I can't remember his name. And I've got a vague memory of him saying, well, this is a good time because you don't have to go to the school that's near you. So my memories of Thatcherism are that. I mean, in some ways I look back and think I was bloody precocious when I went to high school. Yeah. I read the Tory manifesto.
Yes.
Not for the 70, there was the election in 79, the second one.
Okay.
I actually read it and went to political hustings at school. I mean, I was a strange kid, living on this council estate, playing the classical violin in the National Youth Orchestra, going to political hustings. Yeah. I mean, it's no wonder I pissed my mother off in some ways. I mean, because part of that would be not just the aspirational bit, but given her background and my father's and family's, I must have been this odd child culturally.
The Midwich Cuckoo, that sort of science fiction thing about children growing up who were very different from their parents, and perhaps she realised she'd actually produced a conservative. I
don't know. I used to wish that the doorbell would ring, and I would be told there'd been a terrible mistake. That these were not my parents. I mean, I knew the older I got, the more I realised I looked like them.
Yes.
But I used to desperately long to not be related to them, because I had enough self-awareness. I couldn't understand the abuse, the self-destruction, the addiction. I was desperate to escape. So reading was important. We had a great local library. So that was the Thatcherism thing, and that legacy for me was very important because it enabled me to go to a different high school and then for education, and I'm actually grateful for that opportunity. I mean, the book thing. I went to the local library. Now I look back at photos of myself, very, very overweight as a kid, but I was about this big and everybody else was this big. I hit 6 foot tall when I was 11 years old. I mean, I was very tall and I could have knocked 9 bells out of it, but I was very severely bullied, and that's often the case. If you're abused at home, you get bullied at school. And I wouldn't say boo to a goose, but I took myself off to the local library. We had a fantastic, in my mind, it's this huge library. And I went to the children's library, and I started reading a lot when I was younger. C.S. Lewis, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, just devoured books.
And you did this on your own initiative?
On my own initiative.
Okay.
Read and read and read. The only person in my family that read that I knew. And I would wander around the adult library and think, I want books from here. But of course, you couldn't get an adult reader's pass to you at the back then, like 15 or 16. And I don't know how the gumption, I managed to persuade, I remember walking up to some desk somewhere and a counter and pleading with this lady. And she managed to, I don't know, she did something on the forms to pretend I was older than I was. Maybe it's because I looked bigger than I was as well. And I remember it was the most, it moves me to tears, the most precious moment of my life. I had this passport to all these books. So I would go down every Saturday, I would wander around. My wife to this day still says, I mean, I've had a broad interest in everything. I would pick up books on maths and engineering and sports and geography and history. So the first time I went home, I must have gone home with, my memory is about 24 books. I think that was the maximum number of books you could take or something back then.
Potato incident. So was this well received?
You can see what's coming. No, it was not well received by my mother. She opened the door and the first thing she said to me was, who the do you think you are? And just despised this idea. You know, I walked in with all these books, and that must have tapped into, who knows, at whatever level for my mother. It was like she wanted me to read. Yeah. She would tell friends she was proud of me. Yeah. About, I mean, like she would talk. I would hear her. Oh, yeah. Jason goes to the library all the time. I mean, she took pride in that, good. But then would mock me for engaging in it. But then would buy books when I asked for books. It's
so what?
Very confusing.
I mean, what did you ask her and your father to buy you? I mean, what you've mentioned C.S. Lewis. You've mentioned. I mean,
there was
children's authors.
Yes. So books for me were. I think they were escape from abuse. Because I could go into my room and read them, and just before mindfulness was a thing, you know, just lose yourself in a book. I would read every night, every single night, as much as I could. Would read on the bus, and I think early on, I mean, I got like, you know, the famous 5 books,
right? Yeah.
Before they were politically incorrect, and I remember asking my mother for those. I think there were 25 of them or something, and she bought the whole lot for me. There were lots of things my mother would never buy me because she'd say she had no money, but then she would be throwing all her money away on goodness knows. She used to spend it on rubbish all the time. But books she always bought, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, those were key books. But C.S. Lewis was probably the one I remember. It's funny when you memories that you have as a child. Well, this is how mine work. Going into Smith's, a W.H. Smith's, which back then seemed to be enormous, and wandering around the books, and then finding the Chronicles of Narnia and all of them. And I got them in this beautiful box set that I still have. It's one of my most prized possessions, with those beautiful covers and the illustrations. And her just being, that's a lovely memory I have of her always being willing to buy these books for me. And the Chronicles of Narnia are very important for me because I have a memory of at school, before I could read, of having them read to me. So I went into primary school. We used to have this rug, we'd sit down, the teacher would read the book. And it's so vivid, I'm sure I'm recollecting it wrong, but it is like it's yesterday. You know, with the dust in the sunlight, I remember it was a sunny day, and you sat down and you catch the dust, and the teacher's there, and she started reading this story, and I remember the cover, or have a memory of the cover. I may have superimposed, and it's that classic cover that I've got, you know, Lucy dancing with Aslan, and starts to read this story, and it was magical, absolutely magical. And I went to, there was a library next door in the community centre. Unsurprisingly, I had a pass for, or managed to get my mother to. I couldn't read, and I had a pass to get books from the library, and I would take books home my parents would never read these books with me, by the way.
They never read.
And I remember opening these books, and I remember thinking, I want to be able to read these myself.
Gosh.
And I got The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and I don't know, I mean, how old would you be at primary school? 5, 6 years old or something? Yes. Yeah. So reading very basic level, and a book of that level, and I think I taught myself. I mean, I know I must have taught myself to read because I was told by my teachers that my reading age was much higher. I was several years ahead. There was talk of putting me up at school, and they didn't. But
so nobody's doing this for you. You're actually managing to do this
yourself. I was just desperate to read these books. And then, because there were 7 books in the Chronicle of Narnia series, I decided that there were 7 books. I was going to read all 7 of them 7 times. And read them all through, and they were amazing. And ultimately they became my catechism, because I became a Christian when I was turning 17. One of the memories I have, the most traumatic memory I have, is my parents having a fight. My brother and I call it the rubber tree incident, which we laughed about the other day. And it's when my mum had this rubber tree, and she had this, was it baby, can't remember what you called it, this stuff in a little jar, and it was white, and you would put it on plants to look after them. Yeah. Baby bio, I think it was. And she would polish this rubber tree. It gave me the creeps. We just hated this tree anyway. My brother and I are upstairs, and one day we hit my parents having a huge argument, and it literally got down to, my brother's memory is the same as mine, of my dad saying to my mum, "You love that bloody tree more than you love me." And she went, "Don't be so bleep bleep stupid." He said, "Well, we'll see, won't we?" And then we hear this crack and snap. And my brother and I know he has grabbed her rubber plant that she's nurtured for years and snapped it. You could hear the crack. And we both were laughing. We literally were talking about this the other day, laughing about the moment where there was this cacophony of silence into which we knew our mother's wrath was about to be poured. She went berserk. I mean, we can laugh, but it was so traumatic. We went and hid in our rooms. I mean, she tore the house apart. They were fighting each other. It was the worst thing that ever happened. And then my father, who normally wouldn't do anything, got very violent as well. And it resulted in the police were around. My grandmother was there. It was so traumatic. I went and hid in my wardrobe. And this is the line in the wardrobe. And my dad had this coat, and you know the wardrobe in the story. And there were all these things, and I sat in the back, and I'd already done this as a kid a few times because I just wanted to escape my life. And in this incident, I remember I sat at the back, and I was just like, if I sit here long enough, I'll be able to get to Narnia. I wanted out of this situation. I must have been in there for a while because the police left, my nan came, then they called the police because they thought I'd run away. Then the police left, they couldn't find me. And eventually I came out, met my nan, and my nan was very sweet, and she said, "I know things are difficult," and I had no, as a kid you got no ability to say, "I shouldn't be going through this, and please stop this." Yeah. It was so horrific. But fast forward to being 17 and going into church for the first time I'd ever gone into church, and hear someone talk about Jesus, and I became a Christian, had quite a dramatic conversion experience. My whole life then changed. And friends and people would say to me, if you didn't grow up in church, how do you know all these Christian things? Or how, when you hear them, do they make sense to you? Yeah. And I know now my catechism was the Chronicles of Narnia. So I still remember as a kid, for the first time, hearing and then reading when Aslan dies. Yeah. So understanding who Jesus was and his death and his resurrection, I was prepared for. So it's amazing the power of stories.
It's quite powerful, because I have interviewed somebody who, like you, was way ahead in reading age, reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and understanding the first time allegory, or understanding the books are not necessarily literally about what they're about. And from what you're saying, that's your experience as well, to an extent.
Yes. So it was, I knew they were more than, and again, it's difficult because you go, what are your memories then when you're a kid? Sure. And you're always retranslating them. Yeah. So those experiences that I have were that they were more than story. They were, I mean, I knew enough to know that, I knew that Narnia wasn't real. I knew it was a book. Yeah. But there was something about the experience in the story that meant when I was in the water, I wasn't just a kid desperate to escape to Never Never Land.
Yeah.
There was a different world in which probably, good and evil, justice, righteousness, there was something desperate. That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
It wasn't I wanted to get to somewhere just because, there would be fawns and nice things. It was this different reality that I could feel and see in this book. So becoming a Christian was like,
Okay.
this is it. Of course, I didn't realise that C.S. Lewis is a Christian, and
No.
that's what he was doing when he was writing those books.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about your family? Because you come across, even talking about it, and I can almost visualise this young boy. There's a sense of an old head on young shoulders, or a sense of taking responsibility. I mean, you have siblings?
I do. That phrase you just used gave me the chills, because it's the one I heard the most from people. Oh, Jason, he's got an old head on young shoulders. That was it's funny, I haven't heard that since I was a kid. I used to hear that a lot, and I had to be grown up before my time. And I had one brother. He was a different, it's a classical one. I was the older brother, so I was trying to make sure everyone was okay. I was, my mother was, I was the one who was co-opted into her insanity to, look after her and my brother. And then my brother was the other one. He was the opposite of me. He was completely irresponsible, drinking, out late, always in trouble with the police, always in trouble. And yet he was that younger brother that I wanted to be, that I couldn't be. So I was the responsible brother. He was the irresponsible one. And again, one of my favourite stories about him is I remember he went on a school trip when he was at high school. He was the youngest on the trip. And there were a bunch of kids who were like 16, and he must have been, 12. And he got into trouble because they went to the Netherlands or something. He took the older boys around the red light district. That's how precocious he was. But actually, you look back and think his behaviour was another manifestation of the abuse we were having. It's not normal for a 12-year-old to take 16-year-old boys around the red light district.
So you're both very precocious in different ways, I suppose.
Yeah, and he lived out a very violent and I guess it's funny you ask questions, you think about it out loud. That precociousness, was a bouncer when he was 18. He lived in a very adult world in a way that was way beyond his years. He went that way. And we joke about that film with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. Right. The twins. And one's got all the good genes, one's got the bad genes. And we said we were a version of that when we watched that film. I was the one that got the education. He was the one that went down the violence.
So where was your father by this stage?
He went to work abroad when I was at the end of junior school. I wasn't at high school. To the Middle East. Didn't take us with him because basically he didn't want our mother to go with him. We found out we could have moved out there, but and an enormous amount of money, tax-free, that he was doing. Sent it back, a lot of money back, and eventually not all the money he was earning. And then found out much later in life that he ended up, when I was finishing high school, left my mother, and I had another 1-year-old brother at this point. It turns out probably isn't my mother's son. And during that period, at the end of it, turns out he was bigamously married to another woman and started illegally and had a whole other family. But for all intents and purposes, he left when last time I saw him back then, I turned 16, was finishing high school. And then the wheels fell off of our lives. He drove off, disappeared, and I didn't see or hear from him again until I was nearly 40. Was that the answer?
So not a lot of paternal support?
No, none at all. I look back now and think, my dad used to always be sleeping. He was probably drunk most of the time, and probably it was a way to avoid my mother. He was home but not there. He was in a way, he was always nice to us and hugged us, and was never violent to us, never abusive at all. But he never stood up for us, never intervened for us. and ultimately ran away, deserted us because he just couldn't.
Yeah.
And then I found out when he got back in contact, his other family that he'd had. I mean, I was at the point where he got in contact, I wasn't naive enough to think, oh, here's this wonderful father, I'm going to find out he's got this great life and he's a wonderful person. And it was like, I mean, he was the biggest loser ever when I met him again in life. And he had then destroyed a whole other family, and he had become my half siblings tell me about the violence in the family, their family. But from him, I never saw that when I was a kid, but he had it writ large in his second family. So, and alcohol and violence permeate both sides of my working class family. Well, they permeate lots of families, whether they're working class or not, don't they?
And yet, I mean, your academic interests are theology and sociology, and I suppose history to an extent. Mine have always been English literature, and there's this, Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. A lot of critics talk about how, and for his own personal reasons, really, Dickens being briefly abandoned by his parents and put in a blacking factory, he could never really give Oliver Twist any sort of working class characteristics, and if you think of the film with little Mark Lester singing "Where Is Love," which I'm sure you'd have sung at the time, he's the ideal middle class boy with sort of golden hair, with his light streaming through it, etc., etc. And I talk to you now, and you have the voice of a doctor, somebody who's on a doctoral thesis, and a highly educated man. You talk like a highly educated man. And I want to ask you, and I don't mean this facetiously at all, because of your background, were you somehow innately middle class? How do you explain the person that you were even as a child? Teaching yourself reading.
I mean, at the heart of that's the whole issue is nature and nurture. So I think I had some sort of nature that was definitely different to my parents, that came from me and not however it came genetically. So the music and the reading was something I definitely initiated, but other people nurtured. My mother nurtured my reading. The music, because again, this is another thing of Thatcheristic Britain at the time. Because I was gifted at music as a school, but you don't realise that, Get a recorder, everyone else is. I go home, and I didn't realise before now I could read music, and I'm playing music, and I just thought that was normal. But there was an environment in the school I was in through Bedfordshire County Council. I wish I could remember her name. It was a wonderful lady. She turned up at our school and was doing music lessons. And I think what happened was she had me in a class, and obviously I must have stood out from the other kids. Well, before I knew it, I was given free peripatetic lessons. I learned to play the violin. That's how I ended up in this National Youth Orchestra. They paid for a violin for me, lessons for me. And so there was within the education process, someone saw something, and my mother didn't crush that. She was proud of it, but then mocked it.
Yeah.
But she didn't initiate that. She didn't take me to music lessons, but she didn't crush that in me. And I'm like, that must have been instinctively me.
Yes. Yeah.
It must have been.
Yeah.
Always loved classical music. I mean, which kids listen to classical music?
Yeah.
I don't know where that came from.
Exactly.
And I don't know whether that was because it made me feel different and I wanted to be different, or I was different.
That's interesting.
And there are other people I've met who go, they just don't fit in there. I've got a friend, he's in America, but his parents are ranchers, his brother's a rancher, his grandparents were ranchers. He's got a Ph.D. in patristics. I mean, he's like, you talk about the cuckoo, it's like, and he was loved and looked after, but he's just like, and he does the whole ranching thing, but he just knew from an early age, he was just this different creature in his family. Yeah. So I have often wondered, what would I have been like in a family that weren't abusive and were more nurturing? Yeah. What would have happened? My suspicion is the reading, writing, academic side of me would have been engaged more, because once I got older, left home, most of my life from 18 through to my 30s were about survival. I got married, had kids, had to pay the bills, and I lost that side of my life to my detriment. But that was a necessity. I think I probably would have gone to university with middle class parents, and probably would have realised that I loved academics, and probably would have got a Ph.D. in my 20s, and could imagine being a lecturer. You know, that probably is what I would have done.
Absolutely.
But had to come back to this academic side of me later in life that was there when I was younger.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move into your time. I think you said you're going across town to an exclusively white area to school, to secondary school. Now, I mean, for the record, what type of school was it? Was it a grammar school?
No, it was a secondary modern. There had been a grammar school, but it had changed. It stopped being a grammar school. Something weird went. Well, I did an entrance test for a private school, and I'm pretty sure I passed it. But then my parents decided not to fund it. I've got some memory of visiting this beautiful school, and then it all got hush hush. So again, that was some aspirational thing that my parents obviously decided they couldn't afford or wouldn't afford or stuff. But my mother got me, and I went to this secondary modern. It was amazing in lots of ways. Huge school, like I think 1,200 kids, a lot of kids. You know, remember it, and all the subjects. You know, school was traumatic for me, like it is for many people, isn't it? High school is very traumatic. Yeah. But when you're an abused, with a lack of confidence, I was bullied severely through high school.
You were still bigger than a lot of the kids.
Oh, I was bigger. Yeah, was bullied all the way through.
What did people pick on you for? Because there's normally a reason why people bully, isn't
My
there?
weight was what I was back then. I mean, I ended up losing a lot of weight, but there's always something people pick on you. I didn't make friends easily. I wasn't one of the popular kids. I was one of those annoyingly got all his homework done, handed everything early kids. Was never any trouble. So I think I was one of those kids at high school that probably wasn't any trouble. I used to go to parents' evenings. I do remember that contrast. And my mother would say, every teacher would be Jason. I mean, I've kept all my school reports. I don't know when I've done those. And they all say the same thing. Jason's a delight, pays attention, wish I had more students. I mean, that was my whole thing through high school. Yeah. My brother's was the exact opposite. He's a tearaway monster and needs to pay attention. We talk about we're the opposites. And my last school report, when I was 16, it says that Jason's good at everything. His challenge in life is going to be choosing what he really wants to do, which was nice. But that's when everything just got catastrophic. My dad left, had to look after my mum, 1-year-old brother. So high school was traumatic for being a boy and hormones and my mother and everything else. And, it's
successful
amazing.
with girls?
No, completely and utterly unsuccessful until I was 16. I've never told you this story. When I was 16, I suddenly discovered, this is before I was a Christian, I discovered some self-confidence. Yeah. I lost a lot of weight. Yeah. And I started running. Yeah. And I ended up in my last year at high school. There was a girl in the high school, I won't mention her name in case she ever sees this, but she was like the hottest girl in the school. That hot girl that won't go out with any of the other guys because they're too young and immature. Yeah. And I managed to lose weight and impress her and dated her when I was at sixth form college. Right. And it was deeply satisfying for all these guys who'd mocked me for years that I ended up being. Yeah. And actually at that point I played a lot of rugby as well. And I suddenly pressed into sport in my late teens. And I had a sort of a awakening of realising, two key moments in my life were playing rugby, and I'm 16, 17 years old at this point, was always still being bullied. And the guy who was, I again, won't quote his name, I'll get in trouble, but remember him at school, he bullied me all the way through school. And there's suddenly this realisation of coming into my physicality did something. I literally, I was so cross, I picked him up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the frightening things, realising your size and rage, all this unspent rage.
Yeah.
There was a lot more going on when I picked him up than he
Yeah.
represented a lot of things in my life.
Yeah.
Picked him up and threw him.
Yeah.
And I do remember the moment of like, everyone was like, and I remember someone saying, Clark is dead, because he was like the known school hard boy. And he picked himself up and he came over and went, "You're all right, Clark." And after that, nobody bullied me. No one said anything to me. And it was one of those moments you're thinking like, why didn't I do this 4 years? I mean, part of that growing up and coming into self-possession of who you are that had been stifled.
And you realise it. So, Clark is Sam Underhill.
But another moment that flowed from that moment that is quite tragic but was necessary. It's the last time my mother hit me. And I was 17 and she did her usual, went berserk, and suddenly I realised there was this, instead of the normal cowering, it was one of those moments where suddenly everything went quiet while she was beating me, and this woman who was about 5'2" or something, 3, she wasn't very tall, and she just spent her fury on me, and I reached out, I grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the floor, and I said, "If you ever touch me again, I will kill you." I mean, pretty awful thing to have to do.
Yeah.
And she never touched me. From that moment on, never laid a hand on me. Yeah. But again, there was this having to defend in ways that you shouldn't have to do as a kid. But
and she didn't say, "Clark, you're all right."
And she didn't say, "Clark, you're all right." She never talked about it. She moved on to other ways to try and control me. Because if she wasn't going to do that, she'd do other things. So.
But these are big moments for you, and you've talked about Christianity, and this is another fairly significant moment for you at about that time, is it?
The hugest. So, becoming a Christian, my mother got invited to church, Lady Brenda Moulding. But I had an aunt in my family, and she was strange because, this is my dad's sister, half-sister. She was strange because she didn't, as far as I could see, she didn't smoke, she didn't drink, and she didn't beat her children, and she owned her own home. That somehow made her someone to disdain. I mean, my mother just, was... My brother and I remember thinking, what's wrong with Auntie Betty? She seems really nice. And we'd go around her house sometimes for the old family thing and think, it was just a totally different, this middle-class environment, and she was Brethren Christian. And you're like, must be quite nice to live here and not get beaten every day. But when my father left, she reached out to my mother and she contacted one of her best friends, who was the church secretary at the local Baptist church. And it's a phone call that changed my life. So it's one of those things, if Brenda Moulding had not made this phone call, I don't know what my life would be like. But because she phoned my mother and invited her to church, it's the only reason I went to church. And I thought, my life is bad enough as it is without Christians. I mean, again, the irony. My take on Christians, I'd never been to church, didn't know Christians, was through RE lessons, which were useless in terms of understanding the Christian faith. But also my parents' prejudices. So you have these parents that you despise, but you still take on their... Christians are all hypocrites. That was one I was sure of, because my parents had always told me. And I remember thinking, things are bad enough without these weird Christians. Yeah. How could these weird Christians actually make my life any worse, actually? It couldn't have been. Unless they were a cult or something. And they met in a school. So I thought, okay, I'll go. I was the protector, so I will go and look after my mother. It's the only reason I went. And I went to this Sunday service in a hall. And it was everything I did not expect. Firstly, it was in a school hall. It's like, is that a proper church? But they'd outgrown their building, so they were in a school hall. I remember people being friendly. I remember someone who'd been at my high school a few years older than me who talked to me. I mean, the power of being greeted. It's like, these people are friendly, they're nice. Then they had, a band and some modern worship, and they had a guest speaker that day. I think it was a guy called Barney Coombs or someone from the Dales and Wales thing. But anyway, all I remember was being shocked that he talked about Jesus as if he was still alive. I'm like, why has no one told me this? I had no antipathy towards what I was hearing because I'd had no context for it.
Yeah.
So firstly, these people weren't what I expected. And I do remember in worship, and people were quite expressive. And I do remember looking around thinking, these people have something I don't. And I guess you get I am still part of my upbringing. I'm very sensitive to atmospheres. I'm very empathetic and read people.
Yeah.
And I thought there is something different going on here, just in human interactions. So I went back to the evening service because I found out they had an evening service, guest speaker again, got to the end of the service, and I did not want to go home. I think I didn't know how to respond. I knew something was happening to me that I couldn't put into words. So they cleared all the chairs away and I just sat in this chair. I just literally couldn't move. I mean, I look back now and realise it was the presence of God and the Holy Spirit, but I didn't know what that was. Yeah. And the youth pastor came over, realised I was new and visiting, and asked me, he said, do you know what a Christian is? Because he quickly figured out I wasn't one. Yeah. I said no. He tried to, and then he wanted to explain it to me, and he tried to get a journey into life, which is a helpful little booklet that says what Chris. He couldn't find it, but this is one of the things that God in His graciousness did for me. It wasn't just the phone call. I think He arranged that moment because my friend Andrew, we're still really good friends. My youth pastor, as I still call him, he said to me, I can't find this thing. He was 21. It was like, I guess I'm going to have to explain this in my own words. If that was that allowed back then? Can you explain the Christian faith? Yeah. And here is literally how he explained Christianity to me. He said, if you become a Christian, your life may be harder. And I remember thinking, you have no idea what my life is like. And I'm so glad he didn't do that crass thing that some people do, come to Jesus and everything will be. Yeah. And it's like, because you'll have to face up to things and deal with life. And I'm like, okay. He said, but if you become a Christian, I promise you, you will have a meaning of life, adventure and purpose, something to live for and something to die for. And those were probably every key word you could have thought to speak into my life for me, for who I was, and all my influences. And I remember thinking, yes. Yeah. He hadn't told me anything about Jesus, how he died or why. That was enough for me. And he said, sometimes Christians pray a prayer. Do you want to go? I said, no. And we prayed a prayer. I gave my life to Jesus. And it was so powerful existentially, spiritually, emotionally. It's still like I can step back into it and re-experience it. So I went home, and my humble aspirations at this point in life were to be Prime Minister. Yeah. I had my whole life mapped out. I was going to be the first person in my family to get a degree. This is my level of precociousness. Then, but not any degree. I was doing science A levels. I was going to get a chemistry degree, so that I wasn't one of those people who had just done law all their time, but had done something proper. Yeah. So I was going to do chemistry. Then I was going to do a law conversion course. Yeah. Okay. Then I was going to be a lawyer. Yeah. Then I was going to be a barrister. Yeah. Then I was going to be a politician. Yeah. Then I was going to be Prime Minister. That's how I had mapped out my whole life.
And that is the route that Margaret Thatcher took, isn't it? Chemistry.
Do you know? Is it?
Chemistry, then law.
Oh, that's there you go. See, there's those antecedents.
I wonder if you knew that. Perhaps you are.
I probably knew that then.
Perhaps you're channeling Margaret Thatcher.
I was channeling Margaret Thatcher.
Which is quite extraordinary.
It is, isn't it?
No, I mean, I want to say at this stage, nothing from what you actually say, and your past experience indicates somebody who has been sort of primed, like maybe David Cameron or Boris Johnson from their childhood, to expect almost to be Prime Minister, for you to become Prime Minister. That is just so utterly extraordinary.
But thankfully, the first morning I was a Christian, I woke up, and Great Britain will probably thank me for this, or anyone listening to this, and it was my first morning as a Christian, and I knew I had become a Christian. I'd never looked back from that moment in terms of how people who become Christians often talk about the trans. I mean, I look back now and see other things that God was doing in my life, but that was a moment when my identity changed. Yeah. And I remember waking up and saying, "All right, Lord, what do you want me to do with the rest of my life?" Because I knew that's what this meant. Yeah. And I felt like it's the first time I felt God concretely speak to me, say, not be Prime Minister.
Bit of disappointment there.
It was, and realised that dream, moved on to other things in life.
Well, I get the impression from what you're saying, what you said about your mother, that your family life, almost sort of relational life from your parents outwards into the community, probably wasn't that great or that big. So, in a sense, the family is often the term that's used about the Christian church. This was an experience of a different sort of family. Did you find that?
Oh yes. So I quickly realised that a lot of my friends had nothing's changed in some ways. They had antipathy in the youth group to their Christian family in the church, and they were bored it was. I've always found that difficult. I understand that, but found it difficult to relate to because it saved my life. To then have extended aunts and uncles and family. I mean, probably one of the healthiest things for me was we'd go around friends' houses with the youth group, and you see different ways of being family. I mean, it was shocking. It's like, oh, this is what family looks like. Walking home from sixth form college, there were a series of houses from people. In that way, you get with one lovely Baptist churches that I could stop in, and I'd have a cup of tea and a slice of cake, or Josie Rowlands would make me cheese on toast or something on the way home before I got home to have the chaos that was at home. And people asking you about your life, but in a way that so what's God going to do? And praying over me, Jeremiah 29, that God had a plan to bless me and prosper me and frame my life in that way. It was so it was family, it was people that believed in me, people that behaved differently. It was amazing.
It does, from what you're saying, it does. I'll use an image from the world of capitalism and socialism. It does feel a little bit like a poor East German, oppressing their window to the shop window of a supermarket, a West German supermarket where there is plenty, and nobody is saying don't go for those aspirational Jersey potatoes, or I'll give you a good smacking. You can have anything. There's a sense of openness. Was it a bit like that, do you think?
It was relationally amazing, and releasing and nurturing. So John and Beryl, I managed to escape home, even my mother and my brothers. And in some ways I remember the horror, I felt so guilty leaving, but I just knew I couldn't stay in that environment anymore. And in my gap year, I had a gap year, worked for a bank in London. And her and her husband did that thing where they, offered me a room in their house for next to nothing. And it was my first step to being cared for. Used to joke about being my adopted mum. But behave like a mother, but without being inappropriately, overly pretending to be a mother, but just were kind and caring and gave me room. I could come and go, and I just enjoyed that freedom. There was that sort of intervention by people in the church, but then there was this encouragement to what might be next in my life. That was amazing. It was a very special. I was there for three years before I left, and went off to London School of Theology. And it still is one of the most formative pieces of my, not because it's my childhood, but because of where I am now, because of that time there and what happened there.
That's really interesting to hear about your childhood. Can we actually, because that really sets up, in a way, your thesis and your intellectual and academic concerns. Can we fast forward then, past London Bible College through to becoming getting married, having children, and becoming a pastor, and your experience, say your first day, you've done maybe your first day at school, your first day at being a senior pastor of your own church, in a sense.
Wasn't a very happy day. So got married, had kids. I ended up being an investment broker, independent financial advisor in London, which was great, paid the bills for a very stressful, demanding job. And basically became a workaholic. So if alcohol was the drug of choice, I mean, unsurprisingly, like anyone, I mean, I know this enough today, even though I had this miraculous escape and became a Christian and avoided lots of things my siblings did, there's a lot of things that still, some things can be dealt with quickly, but other things work out as you go into life and you stages of life. And realise I've become a workaholic. You know, if I work, and that comes from, I know now, a determination to not be like my parents who were work shy and, you know, and so if I work hard enough, then I won't be like them. And you make those awful vows to yourself, as long as I'm not like them, that doesn't sustain you very long. So, and got involved, and one of the great things about Evangelical Church is it's a good place to grow, but it's also a place to sometimes, the environment I was in, to be very busy. And this, you know, I was you know, I think there was a bit of, I would spot it in other people now, you know, Jason's is a wise head on younger shoulders, as opposed to, what the heck happened to you that you have not sorted out? This is not a level of it's not normal for 19-year-olds to be pastoring and looking after 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds. That's not just an ability, there's something, the risk of something there. And eventually all that stuff caught up with me through, you know, my stuff, being a workaholic. I've been working probably 110 hours a week. So I was doing this job, my wife and I planted a church, I'd walked away from all my clients and the money that we had, which I have never regretted, but it all caught up with me. And my first morning as a full-time paid pastor, I remember the dream I had. I often don't remember dreams, but this dream was very vivid. I was at a wake for a funeral, going around a house, and I was trying to find the person who was trying to find someone in charge, and it's like everyone was ignoring me, and I got more and more frustrated. And then I realised I didn't know whose funeral it was. And then I got right at the end of the dream, I was literally shouting at someone and said, "Whose funeral is this?" And someone eventually turned around to me and said, "It's yours." And I woke up. As I woke up, I heard an audible voice, whether I heard one or imagined one, and it said, "Say goodbye, you're about to die. Say goodbye to your wife, you're about to die." And as I woke up, I had what I realise now was the first panic attack I'd ever had, an enormous panic attack. Hyperventilating, couldn't breathe, because I didn't know what was going on. I was 30 years old at this point. And didn't know what was going on at all with that. And then gradually, well, not gradually, but quickly unravelled from that. I ended up, did the usual thing with people who suffer from anxiety and panic attacks. Went to hospital with a few suspected heart attacks that weren't heart attacks. Found out they were panic attacks and anxiety. Diagnosed with depression. I was diagnosed with several things. One of them was anxiety-induced depression, general panic disorder. I had derealisation and depersonalisation. They were awful symptoms. I remember I would look at my hands or look at my reflection, and it felt like I was in, it wasn't me, I was in, and it's a defence mechanism of your body to deal with anxiety. I was in somebody else's body, this wasn't my body. It was and that caused panic as well. It was a pretty awful time. Very dark time, tough time for my wife.
Absolutely.
She jokes now about having had 4 children. We had 3 kids, but she talks about when I became the 4th one. But God in His graciousness, I mean, it's why I ended up where I am now and doing a lot of what I'm doing, including coming back to academic, this love of books and reading and writing. And one of my memories was I would take the Bible to bed with me. My poor wife, I could not go to sleep without her being with me and waiting till I'd gone to sleep. Because it's hard to describe anxiety to someone who doesn't suffer from it. The way I've described it to people is I said, you know, in a movie when you see someone has a gun pulled and you think, what would it be like if you had a real gun against your head and you thought any second they're going to pull the trigger? That's what panic attacks for me felt like. I couldn't make them go away, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't fight them. And I had these debilitating panic attacks. And I would take the Bible to bed and hold it on my chest, and I would say, Lord, I know this is important. I just didn't know how to read it anymore. And my faith up until that point had been quite experiential. As I say, I realise I look back now as a child and I had a lot of experiences of God but didn't know what they were, including a trip to Coventry Cathedral. And went through this very dark night of the soul, dark night of the senses. But look back, it was God's grace, because it was very important, and I rediscovered that there was part of me that I had not been nurturing, or the overwork was a drug.
Okay.
And I ended up going back to do some theology. So I went to see a friend who was very safe, who I could talk about my doubts and fears, because it didn't feel safe at the time in my church environment to do that. Whether it was or not, I don't know. And I sat down with him in a pub with a pint. He'd heard I'd been ill, and he'd been the vice principal of the London School of Theology, and then become an Anglican priest. Wonderful, wonderful man. And he was one of the reasons I went to London School of Theology. And I said, Nick, do you believe in hell? And he went, you're there. And had this wonderful conversation over a beer. And I realised I'd done a theology degree. You'd think with a love of books that would have been something I enjoyed. But I went through that in this very active survival mode, very involved in church. There were moments when I realised I was very engaged, but I missed that opportunity. So I went back to London School of Theology, registered for some master's research that I didn't complete, but then I went on to do a Doctor of Ministry degree, a professional doctorate, and suddenly this side of me came alive.
It's right, I want to say it's like finding Narnia again.
It was. And I remember my friends around me who were very pragmatic church planters, sort of, some of them warning me, you can't do both, you can't do academics and, I mean, it was a professional doctorate, it wasn't massively academic, but it was enough that it fed me, it brought me alive. I saw a lady that did, she was a Gallup strengths finder person, and I went to see her. You know when you go and see those people and they do these psychometric profiles of you, and it's like they read your mail. Yeah, sure. And she said to me, she said, that's unusual. She said, you've got these four things, these don't normally go together. She said, you've got intellect and learner, an activator and achiever. She's very unusual for those to go together. Yes. And I hadn't said anything to her. She said, that means, she said, you need to be doing things, but you need to be thinking them through and taking them apart. Yeah. And she said, if you don't do the two together, you won't thrive. She said, you need both for the other. She said, what have you come to see me about? And I was saying, can I stay as a church planter and do academic study at the time, which at the time I just didn't think I could do both. Yeah. And I sort of said, well, you just answered my question without me even answering it. And that side of me came alive, and it helped me, the thinking side, helped me grow my own faith and discover more about the Christian faith that I wasn't getting, that no one else was giving to me. And ultimately became what I get to do. And I've ended up doing a Ph.D, but I help pastors who struggle with church life to engage in why church is still important and not give up. I help people that have given up on church to understand church. It was just another level for my own faith. So a pretty traumatic day that led to some very good things in my life.
So you, by that stage, had you encountered people who were giving up on church? Or didn't seem to want to press through in the way that you personally had when you were 16 or 17?
I think yes and no. Yes, as in I'd noticed a general sort of antipathy and boredom that sometimes came towards. But the church that I was in, and I know you were too, was actually quite exciting. There was a lot happening in a fast-growing church with lots of people in it. So I think that masked some of the general malaise that you might have seen with other Christians who just, would grow out of church and go to university and drift off and get bored with it. But it wasn't until we planted a church in the late 1990s, 1997, that suddenly realised that the greatest challenge I was bumping into were Christians who just couldn't be bothered with church anymore. I got very involved in a thing called emerging church conversations, as they were for a good 20 years ago. and things like fresh expressions and other stuff. And there was a whole group of people that were, part of it was sociological, part of it was spiritual, was a sort of Malay, a shared questioning about church and the nature of church and the context of church to culture.
Right, yes.
That was resulting in a trajectory that's still happening today, but two things even then, that was a manifestation of that. Lots of our friends who would not just give up on, not just go away from church, but would become what I would now describe as post-church, like anti-church. The problem is the church. So if we have nothing to do with church, we can be Christians, which is just nonsense, and I now know why it's nonsense. Or a few who became Anglo-Catholic and actually went off to become Anglican priests. So a lot of the people that we were even at London School of Theology with as contemporaries, many of them have ended up in this post-church environment with great antipathy towards the church, or a few of them have quite a significant number, and often would joke, how long would it be before I became an Anglo-Catholic?
Yes.
And that's the sort of anecdotal trend of my friends into those environments. But with this background of the fastest growing group in the Western world, white middle class Christians who go to church when they haven't got something else on. And bumped into that immediately in church planting that I think I'd missed when I was in a church that everyone was sort of excited about and involved in. And that set me on the route to, well, why is this?
Yeah.
Why are we, a phrase I borrowed from a guy called Dan Kimball, who's a friend, in one of his books, he talked about the church has become a dispenser of religious goods and services.
Yes. Yeah.
People come here to get something over there. This is not who they are.
Yeah.
And I was interested in that for lots of reasons. One, because that wasn't my experience of the church. The church was, theologically, the church is supposed to be our mother, introduces us to Christ. It was not, it was God's people to worship him and to be this place to grow as a, and it had been for me. And it wasn't a means to an end. And so I sort of like, well, how did my Christian friends or these other people who call themselves Christians get there? And what's going on in the world that I feel like in this new church plant we had, we're here for an on-demand service when you need a top-up or something. How did we get there? Yeah. And that's got progressively, it hasn't got better, it's got worse over the last 20 years. And my research mostly has ended up, that's what my PhD ultimately ended up being in, what's the sort of symbiotic relationship between evangelicals, which is my broad tradition, and capitalism and consumer culture that has led to this category. Because evangelicals used to be the opposite, but they've ended up white middle class evangelicals in particular.
Well, let's move on to this. I mean, you tease me because my my sort of doctoral thesis was, as you say, on comic books, pulp fiction, boys' own adventure. And one of the subgenres is the detective story. So you're massively curious. That's come out. You've used that word a number of times. Yeah. You're Sherlock Holmes then. Okay. The evangelical church is, if you like, the crime scene. This is a detective story. Yeah. And you're not on your own. You have here Dr. Watson, who's going to ask dumb questions, and which you have to correct. But you also have other, say, consulting detectives who are theologians and academics who've written about this. So, what was the actual title of your thesis?
Do you know, having become terrible, you think this thing that you do for best part of a decade, part-time and 8,000 hours, I'm never going to forget. And I know I struggle to remember the title of it. I think it was Evangelicalism and Capitalism. I mean, here's the academic imaginative I was. I had all these, like Worship as Re-narration was one of the fanciful titles. Yes. But then I thought, I want people in the British Library or journal searches, when they search my thesis for it to, so I literally went, Evangelicalism and Capitalism. That's the main title. And it does work. People searching those two terms, it pulls it up. A reparative... Yes. You've probably got it written down, haven't you? I've got it written down. Of course I have. A reparative diagnosis of pathogenesis in the relationship. Yes.
And I go, blimey, it's got words in it that I can't even pronounce. So what's that?
So what that was, that was definitely what I did with the thesis, which is what's the developing relationship between these two broad things, evangelicalism and capitalism. And a reparative meant it had an end in mind. I was making an account not to be devastatingly destructive about evangelicalism, but because I wanted to seek if my account could help it be a reparative for restoring itself. Sure. And it was a diagnosis of pathogenesis. Pathogenesis is the, is often a medical term, but I'm using it in this space theologically, borrowed it, because it's the mutation from the interaction of the two things. Okay. So pathogenesis would be not what's the root cause, but where have these things interacted in a way that have multiplied it this way. So that was what the title meant. And then the method for it was in two halves. One sort of social theory accounting, which was a way to look at evangelicalism in the relationship, and the other one, the theological diagnosis, but drawing out theology in both sections and looking at them. I mean, I had what I call a mapping method. The idea was, can I make a map of the relationship, not that was perfectly diagnostic, but one that people would recognise. So if they wanted to sort of follow through, how did we get here? They could sort of go, I can try this myself. Yeah. But the purpose of a map is also it's never complete, is to go, there's a bit missing here, or that doesn't work there. Yeah. So it was always a work that was to enable navigation, but with a mind to go, well, here's where it works and it doesn't work, because it was very adventurous, those two huge domains. Yeah. And right at the end of it, actually, it's funny you use the scene of the crime thing. I used the metaphor of, how scenes of crimes are mapped out on the chalk. Right. And I said, I used that metaphor, and I said, my thesis serves as a sort of chalk mark on the floor of here's where the body was, kind of thing, and how did it get there.
So you're like Kojak then?
Kojak with more hair. We loved you, baby.
So, I mean, these are big terms you're using, capitalism and evangelicalism.
Yes, they are.
Capitalism, I'll maybe let you unpack later, but evangelicalism, I mean, not everybody really outside it understands what is actually meant by that, or its history.
It's interesting. One of the things I argued for in my method, because I had various academics saying, well, if you say evangelical, there's lots of different kinds. What kind? You're going to have to focus on one little kind and one type. And what I argued, and my examiner was in full agreement with, is it's not how people use language. There's a thing called illocutionary shell nouns. Right. It's normal. Yeah. If I say to you, my friend's a pilot, you don't go commercial, military. I mean, we don't do that in language. Right. You're an academic. You know that absurdity where we use language. It's freighted with so many meanings. And we know those meanings are provisional, but we know enough to know what we're talking about. And I know there's lots of different kinds of evangelicals in history, but an evangelical knows an evangelical. When you go, I'm an evangelical, you don't go, what kind of evangelical? I mean, you know what it is, but you know what it isn't. Yeah. So I argued for that. That's how I wanted to talk about evangelicals, firstly in the way that they do, but it meant doing a lot of background to them. So I wasn't trying to prove what evangelicals were.
But is there somebody who's kind of nailed that down?
Yes,
in the field?
So David Bebbington. You can't talk about evangelicals. In every academic sphere, there's always someone who's done something that you have to talk about. So David Bebbington's got this thing. And it's one of those ones that, you do all the work on it and you know the conclusion. The conclusion is going to be, he's broadly right. Yeah. Here is where everyone contests him. You have to show all the people that contest him. But here's why they still broadly accept him. And here's where it might be changed. But having said that in several thousand words, now it's like clearing your throat. It's that prolegomena. It's like, now we can talk about it. Now I've proved, and it was a lot of work, and it was very important to make sure I knew what evangelicals were. Yeah. So I did a lot of, and it wasn't in the thesis, a lot of historical reading and background reading, not to do a history of the development of evangelicals. Yeah. I was looking for something specific so that I could talk confidently about evangelicals. I was trying to do actually more than specific. What spurred me on were people like John Milbank, the academic, because it was an academic, who said basically in shorthand, evangelicals are the bastard child of capitalism. Right. A pretty brutal thing to say.
It's pretty brutal, yeah.
Other people, academics, want to assert, and William Connolly was someone I worked against. They make this assumption that they know evangelicals, and evangelicals produce capitalism, and capitalism produces evangelicals. There's this awful symbiosis that means, evangelicals are just this product of something horrible that's happened. They're not separate from it, they're intrinsic to the problem. But they never did the research to prove that. And I was like, well, excuse my language, screw you. I'm an evangelical. I'm going to go and show you. You might be right about some of the manifestations, but you're wrong about who we are. And I had to dig very deeply in. I mean, so David Bebbington, you have to use him. And then various people, Mark Knoll in particular, people would use. But again, it was to situate that and go, actually here. And that was fascinating.
So what does Bebbington actually say? I mean, what things distinguish
what he's known for is his quadrilateral. It's called Bebbington's quadrilateral. And you end up with 4 things that are distinctive for evangelicals. It doesn't mean other people don't have them in forms of Christianity. And I'm going to get these in the wrong order. So it was crucicentrism, conversionism, activism and biblicism. Now, it's the activism that makes evangelicals unique. So the other ones, conversion, you have to become a Christian. That's key for evangelicals. I mean, there is no evangelical creed, by the way. This is a historical survey of where all these streams of types of Christianity came together that called themselves evangelical. Biblicism, high view of the Bible, it's not made up. Literary criticism is not to take the Bible apart and it's all myth. It's a book by real people, and Jesus was a real person. So high view of the Bible, and the crucicentrism, the cross, and conversionism, that there's transformation and change. But what Bebbington is most well known for of those 4 things is the activism. And to put it crudely, what that means is evangelicals want other people to become Christians. Calvin was not an evangelical. He stayed in Geneva. He didn't start missions agencies. He didn't send people off to convert the neighbouring towns and cities. It's evangelicals who come along and go with the Wesleys and Whitfield in particular, who move out of their form of faith and into what became Methodism, and move from a Calvinistic, from a Puritan background and a Calvinistic Protestantism into evangelical Methodism that emerges. And it's very different. A confidence of going into the world. This is the capitalism bit. I found out why were they able to go into the world. So Wesley is able to say, the world is my parish. That is as much an economic statement as a spiritual one, an ecclesial one. The only reason the world was his parish was because he lived at a time when the world could be his parish. Whereas for Calvin in Geneva, that wasn't possible. So activism is this thing, and evangelicals want more people, not to become evangelical, well, they want people to become Christians. And that's the explosion that happens with evangelicals. And then evangelicals are situated broadly. I mean, there's a much bigger picture of you get to, well, where does, I mean, one of the things I looked in my thesis is sort of I showed 3 epochs. You've got Protestant industrialism, then you've got commercial society with Methodists that moves beyond the industrial society, and then we get to globalization and the Pentecostal versions of charismatic evangelicals and all that explode, not just evangelicals, but this intensification around not just evangelicals but Christianity, and this change. And evangelicals have got their particular process they go through. But activism
is the thing that sets evangelicals apart, and that's linked to changes in society. I mean, as a non-historian, I tend to have this picture of the medieval times, and everybody's a peasant and living in bogs, and they have no money, and they have lots of children, and they all die of plague, or and something is happening in that first stage. Is it in terms of people living longer?
Yes,
and it's a world over which God is, presiding in terms of the monoculture. And I suppose people have to explain to themselves why things are getting better.
I mean, yes. So, I looked at Bebbington, I looked at Weber's Protestant work ethic, and then Robert Tawney, who's a counter to him. So you get onto people like Weber and the Protestant work ethic that would say there is a way that Protestants live. The Protestant work ethic is the way that Protestants live within growing capitalism. There's an aesthetic to their life that leads to the production. It's this process that happens of, they're the people that, it's Christians that there's an explosion in printed music, and leaflets and pamphlets and books, and what ultimately the Christianity gets jettisoned, and we end up post-Weber with you say you can't have consumer society without Christians and a Protestant work ethic, definitely. But you've got people like Tawney who are saying, no, Robert Tawney, it's the other way around. There was this development from industrial society to commercial and what we would call late capitalism and globalization, and that required a religion. And which produced? Did the Christians produce the capitalists? So this is what Weber was asking. Why? And he asked this explicitly. Why, when people in history have been deeply suspicious of wealth, do you end up at a point where wealth becomes, the culmination of proof that God favours you and is for you? And that's what the Protestant work ethic looks at in part. And I critiqued Weber and I found my own little thesis in there. But Tawney's at the other end. Well, this process just required a religion, and Christianity came along with it. And of course, being a good academic, of course I said, well, they're both right, they're both wrong, and it's a mixture of those and something else. That's what you do, don't you?
That's what you do. Well, let's come on to your own thesis and how you explain the changes, with a particular, just so we move on to it, a particular analysis, critique of how Christians seem now to want the capitalism without necessarily the cruciform life, if you like, the pain of real Christian discipleship. Yes. So let's go back to Calvin and that time.
Well, it's one of the ironies in my thesis that it's the epiphenomena that I'm most interested in, and that's the bit that you're not supposed to put in the thesis.
Because you're an activist.
Because I'm an activist and I'm a pastor. It was like, I want to know what's happened so that I can. Yeah. So, again, what do you want to know about? How do we get from Calvin to...
Yeah, just quickly, if that's possible, say, 5 minutes, how you get the psychological effects on people, if you like. Yeah.
Well, some of the little asides I remember on, reading around, that Calvin was against usury, because Calvin couldn't imagine a world where the Christianity was formed where he was, where the poor weren't cared for.
Right, okay, yeah.
That was just part and parcel of being Christian for him. Yeah. And some of the religious constraints, Calvin, it's J.T. Noonan, the scholastic analysis of usury, some of the ways that what Calvin did and how he did it that broke the link and the fear of usury. Yes. But Calvin had an understanding of Christianity that meant, well, yes, we can be different in this approach to how we engage in what would be called usury, but Christians behave in certain ways. There are still these religious protections around stuff and aspirations for life. It's actually more, I found in my research, it was more Martin Luther that's most interesting. Weber's Protestant work ethic, he focuses on Calvin, and a lot of other academics think wrongly so. It's Luther's idea of calling that is most transforming, the idea of the individual before God, who has to find what their calling in life is. It's a broad, lots of evangelicals today, what are you called to? That's still an instinctive thing. Yes. Which actually was a terrifying place. You look at what became, part of what I was interested in was looking at the sociological, the economic, and as well as the spiritual dynamics. So if you're going from, good grief, infant mortality worldwide was like 30 in the 1830s, and that was included the UK. The 18th century is an unbelievable scale of transformation. I found a journal by a guy called Joseph Ryder, and he was a Calvinistic Protestant who became a Methodist entrepreneur in his life. And I think his wife died when he was young, got remarried, and he does this sort of post-Puritan journaling of his life. Yes. And what emerges in his journals is a wonderful picture into how people were deeply suspicious of living longer and making money. Yeah. And the Protestant Calvinists early on in life, they made all this money, but they didn't get drunk. They made stuff in this new world that everyone was buying, and they became phenomenally rich and philanthropic. Yeah. But were very suspicious of the world. And it's Methodists that eventually come along and go, maybe we could enjoy this a bit and have a different approach to, and Christian fashion and music and stuff emerges with Methodists in this explosion, this emerging world. But there's all these anxieties going on in the background. There's the anxiety, is living longer okay? Is making money? I mean, things that we find strange to understand today. But Weber was right. People were deeply suspicious of them. And going from a Catholic world in the Protestant world that had emerged to how do you know that you're saved? There was this deep anxiety, all these anxieties, and particularly if you read Bebbington, that comes across. You realise all these people are going on like, we've left, with the Catholicism and the mass, and the priest told you were saved. The raw, I guess this gets back to Luther, the raw individual, isolated before God, responsible. You are now responsible, your eternity, in the midst of all this change.
It's awesome, isn't it?
It's amazing. It's staggering in how we got there. But so this is where the Luther and the calling is part of how that unfolds. And most human beings can't navigate that on their own socially. And part of what my thesis looked at is a sort of little mini thesis that I suggested was, what you do is you go from these Protestant Calvinists who, it's a sort of sleight of hand. So to go away from a Catholicism where the church tells you that you're saved, Bebbington's thesis was about assurance of faith. So the Puritans were always agonising, how do I know I'm saved? Because where does that come from? Well, because you're not Catholics anymore. If the church can't tell you you're saved, you're a naked individual before God. You've got to scrutinise your life for signs of the regenerative work of God. And what I said was, I think there was a sleight of hand that took place. Assurance moved into providence. And how you knew you were saved was because you started making money. Right. Providence was the new assurance, in other words. And you can see how that would work for people. You have to, if we're living longer and making money, and if we know, so Methodists in particular come along, by the way, and they were deeply suspicious of emotions, but not for conversion. So the way that you knew you were a Christian was you had this emotional induction. But after that, you had to be suspicious of your emotions. So here's how I put this crudely. So imagine a world in which everybody is now living like a Protestant Calvinist. You're making money in a capitalist system. And then the question arises, that used to be how you knew you were a Christian. But now everyone's doing that.
Oh, right. Yes.
Even the people that aren't Christians.
Yes.
That's the new matrix, this emerging economic world. Everybody starts to live like Protestant Calvinists, and capitalism is exploding. How do you know you're a Christian?
And how do you know you're a Christian?
Because as a Methodist, like John Wesley, your heart's been strangely warmed. Yes. There's this inner turn to the emotions that was very different. Now, the other thing I looked at my thesis later on as well, what happens when everyone's heart is suddenly strangely warmed? And again, the question still arises, how do I know I'm having a genuine Christian experience? So that was a sort of route I tried to show of how we get a suspicion of providence moves into the providence is the sign that you're a Christian. And ultimately what I was showing was I didn't go anywhere near health and wealth and prosperity because it's just not my church tradition. Sure. And it would be a blindingly obvious one. It's like this thing on steroids, but I wasn't interested. What I was more interested in was your average evangelical who, this is the epiphenomena, gives up on church when life happens because they didn't get the great job they wanted, the great marriage they wanted, and live in the great house they wanted, in the great place they wanted. It's more than over-realised eschatology. Their belief that God is involved in their life is predicated on providence within a capitalist matrix. Right, okay. And that's what I was trying to get to about why that happens and why these group of Christians in particular use church in their worship and their practices to get this. So I say as epiphenomena as a pastor, when people turn up at my church, and I haven't seen them for a while, and sometimes the service has started, and if I'm at the front, I'll see them come in the back. And I'll literally think, it's nice to see some. Some people could come once a month because that's their norm, but I'm talking about the people that come 3 times a year or once a year. We get some people that come to our church once a year. And I'm like, what awful thing has happened to them? And usually the less frequent their attendance, but when they do turn, and it does, they'll go, I've lost my job. I've got horrible illness. My wife's left me. And I'm glad they're with us. But what I was with my thesis, I was trying to get to, what happens that you come here when the resources that you have for life run out? And one of the ironies is they're usually people who at one point were very involved in church.
Right.
And they maintain their faith outside of the church because a church trained them in how to carry on having some practice of their faith. Which is, by the way, why people that aren't Christians can never pick and mix the Christian faith. They don't have the post-church version of Christianity and consumer culture is only possible because there was a point where people had discipleship practices that mean they can sustain their picking and mixing later on.
Yes.
I mean, eventually it does break down for people, and a lot of people completely lose their faith. But that was a long answer to your question. That's where I was trying to get to with the research.
So what you're seeing in your church as the sort of, if you like, the problem, with your own experience must be very difficult for you to accept, is people using you as a pastor and using the church as a dispenser of religious goods and services.
Yes.
They come to you
Yes.
when the car needs servicing, or effectively they need an MOT, or they need
Yeah.
an upgrade of some sort.
Yeah,
you know,
it can feel like that.
a
It can
new
feel like
job
that.
or a new wife, or
Yes, it can feel like that.
it can feel like that, which must be quite dispiriting.
Yes, it is.
So is there a point then, I know you're not a historian, but you've talked about Methodism with some enthusiasm. Is there a point where you think that there is a balance in the periods that you've looked at where people still, if you like, they maintain that view of usury, and now anybody can go out and get a loan, can't they? We're saturated by offers of loans. People still don't like usury, but they're opening up to the positive aspect of an individual before God, and moving into God's purposes and moving into a sort of creativity. What would be the best time, do you think?
The problem with even reviewing because I wasn't a historian, but if I was to look at those epochs and say, there's always the danger that you pick a time that actually, if you had a time machine and were then, it wouldn't have been as great as you thought it was.
Sure,
you know what I mean?
sure,
So
absolutely.
all those academic caveats aside,
Yeah.
I think there must have been something in Methodism that must have been that even the best academics, Bebbing told me himself, saying there's so much more there to research. I think the austerity of the Protestant Calvinists that preceded Methodism must have been pretty austere.
Yes.
I mean, there's something exciting that you read about. Wesley, I mean, he got in a lot of trouble for this a lot of the time. I mean, he wrote books on electricity and health, and didn't he restart one of his friends' hearts or something? He had a heart arrhythmia.
Machine, I think, which is in the museum up in London, where he was he was an educated man at Lincoln College, but and never really, for himself at least, I don't know what he thought about the other people, threw away things like his interest in Shakespeare. And I think there was a sort of, as there sometimes is, the more constricted generations afterwards edit out from the founder the things about it that they can't cope with.
Eccentricities that were.
Yeah. He's reading
that's-
Shakespeare on horseback.
But that side of him I love, and the fact that, reading stories that, he had this grueling schedule for pastors of what they had to do every day for, their disciplines and their prayers and their reading, and he was one on education. And if they couldn't afford books, he would buy their books, and back when books cost real money. And so that sort of that Methodist Arminianism, confidence in the world, engagement in music and creativity, but tempered with what evangelicals would say, we're supposed to be in the world but not of it, in the church but not of it. I think that would have been an exciting time on the cusp. Whereas where we are now, it's just this place that there's almost no suspicion of money for evangelicals, and the sign that, and it still is, God has failed you if you haven't got this consumer dream. That's what that I got to. So maybe that time would have been there would have been all the other problems inherent to it, but it would have been, that's a time, if I had a time machine to visit Christians, to see Methodism in its in its heyday in the midst of that cultural transformation. It must have been very exciting.
Because the world is in a sense your parish, because you speak internationally, and again, it's, you know, particularly links with America, wasn't it? With
I do. I mean, I lead a global postgraduate program, doctoral ministry program for Portland Seminary with students from around the world, and we do our online. I mean, do things that you could never do before. We're the beneficiaries of this globalized world for education and hybrid learning and stuff. It's phenomenal. I mean, that's sort of the plea and outworking of my PhD, is that we've and the best academics that I engaged with who critique the problems of faith and culture, we end up with this. We have this ability with the world that we're in now to do so much with it, but what we do is so inane and so focused on ourselves and providence, and that are so in a way crass. You think, is this the best we can do? And at the heart of my evangelical project, because it was an evangelical project, to rediscover our evangelicalism of that we should be in the world, but not too much of it, and to recover why we're too much in the world. But also, we need to be in the church, but not of it. But we need to be a bit more in the church. There's an epilogue I put at the end of my PhD, and I said, look, if I go around the world, whether I'm meeting a conservative Southern Baptist or a progressive evangelical from Scandinavia, who have very different views, but lots in common. I've, over the years, similar comments when they say, so what's your research on? And I'll say, and I've phrased it broadly, and I've made it like a little sort of scripted epilogue. I'll say, well, you know that your job, home and relationship are supposed to be given in service of Jesus Christ. That's the evangelical faith horizon that I talked about. Evangelicals around the world of all stripes, and they'll go, yeah, everything I have is Jesus, to invest for him. And then I would say, what I'm looking at is why we don't live like that. And they go, what do you mean? Why do we use Jesus to get those things? And then they'd all go, yeah, why is that? And almost all my evangelical constituents have that. That's a paraphrase of that conversation. How did we get there? And my great hope and desire is that if evangelicals could, I mean, there's nothing, I'm not against, I've got Anglo-Catholic friends, and there are Anglo-Catholic evangelicals, and that's all the distinctions to make. But why I still want to be an evangelical, that actually we need to sort of recover a bit of the Protestant work ethic. That would be good for us. And to discover that evangelical way of life, that God is at work in the world everywhere, and we can engage there instead of hiding from it and going on holiday all the time from it and doing all the other things that consumerism does to us. Isolates us, withdraws us. We should be the most vibrant group of, and in actual fact, I showed in my research, evangelicals are in many ways still the most vibrantly engaged in the world. It just depends, which constituency.
Well, let's move on to the positives. I mean, how do evangelicals move forward and at the same time reclaim perhaps what they've lost a little bit? Just maybe one or two examples, people you've seen do it, or activities that would encourage that?
I think one of the things evangelicals would do well is to recover their own heritage. Because we're so amnesic about who we are, let alone the rest of the church in history. But I think, again, I'm the pastor. I always go to where does no amount of reading does this for people, it's again for the epiphenomena. Let me phrase it this way. I was speaking at a conference. I get to do this, conference of church people, and thinking, how do you translate this into language that they can connect to identify where they are and the hope of what our gospel can do? And when I say, anyone here has struggled with an awful divorce? I remember one conference, a couple of thousand, hundreds of hands. It felt like hundreds of hands, lots of hands. Anyone here got mental health struggles? Anyone struggling with kids who are self-harming? By the time you list all those things, you've got like half the room who put their hand up. And you go, this is what living in this consumer society is doing to us. Does our faith have something to ameliorate that and to help us live differently? And I think that's the first place we've got to get in touch with what this way of life is doing to us. So another story, a friend recently went to the funeral of someone they'd been in their youth group with 30 years ago who'd committed suicide, tragically killed himself 3 weeks after his son's wedding. And what she was shocked at, I was just listening to her, all the friends that they'd been in this thriving evangelical youth group in an Anglican church. And you could see as she's telling, you know, there were people, you know, they got divorced and life had happened and things like that. They had all, so many of them either had no faith at all or were angry with God and were just nowhere with church.
Yeah.
And and again, had done all that manifestation of all of that.
Yeah.
I was just listening to her, and you could see her looking back to her memories
Yeah.
of when they were young, you know, teenagers and Christians in their late teens, early 20s. She said, I found myself thinking, what on earth did you sign up for?
Right.
I was there.
Yeah.
We didn't sign, the heart of the evangelical imagination, we didn't sign up for an easy life.
No.
We signed up to follow Jesus and invest our lives for him.
Yeah.
So even there was that manifestation of, we've got to be honest, what the heck do we think we're signing up for one thing, but
Yeah.
actually really there's this other story that is around us every day that we're living. That's one of the other things we've got to expose, what's the effects of this on us, and stop pretending that we can keep living like this without these consequences. And then maybe we can plug in, recover some of the best of our evangelical faith.
And we've joked in the past, we both come from a time which was beige, you know, black and white television.
Yeah.
You know, then the test card and colour television. And the imaginary was very different. And the imaginary was, the cultural imaginary was much more to do with books perhaps than it is now. And people are so, I mean, I have teacher friends who say that, you know, their pupils wander across campus looking at their phones, and the phones are so visually enticing.
Yep.
I mean, how do you think it's possible to?
I mean, I did put a little
counteract
bit. I did put a little bit in my PhD. We're using some of the work of James K. Smith about habits and practices, because this is what's ultimately is going on underneath it. And worship is a way to have habits and practices that change what we desire. I mean, there's this whole process that I was looking at. How does what we love shape what we do, and how does what we do ultimately shape what we love? But yes, say smartphones, the way that works at every level, psychologically, chemicals in our brains, habits and dispositions, attention, and we are permanently distracted from the important things in the world that, if as a Christian, require very different habits and practices. Yeah. And some of us can't enter into Christian practices or lose Christian practices because we have all these other awful habits and practices that produce these shallow, superficial engagements with the world. So putting a phone away and engaging differently is one of those things to learn to do.
And that's something which is quite difficult to compete against, isn't it? That other world. So, I mean, do you know of any situations or sort of types of church which manage to counteract?
Gosh.
They have a cultural runoff, you know, that is able to counteract.
Do you know, all the pastors I talk to, I mean, I've got an amazing church with amazing people who live differently, but there is still this, it's like entropy that sucks people away there. You know, Jesus tells us some parables of, you know, the weeds and the stuff, you know, life happens, and this is but it does feel like, not just academically, but when I talk to other pastors, that people expect more and more from church, like the dispensing of religious goods and services, with less and less involvement and engagement from them. It's getting worse, not better. Right. And I don't see broadly where that is changing. More Christians leaving church than ever, more young people giving up on their faith than ever. You know, a few little outposts and glimmers, but it's not great at the minute. And maybe it's going to have to get a lot worse before people recover their faith. Because it's what I talked to my church about just this morning. It's like, do you want to, we choose to live like this. We have this amazing freedom to live differently. Do we want to? Or are we going to carry on with these consequences? And that's part of how we think there aren't any consequences, and we can have our attention sucked away from us, and we can become anybody that we want to, and we can't. So I'm a little despondent, to be honest with you, and a lot of my friends are.
Well, can we come back to, and it's been wonderful talking to you, and we have to throw in the Gramsci thing, don't we? Was it pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will? You're not going to, I know you are, you're not going to give up.
Did you say Gramsci?
Yeah.
Oh, Gramsci.
Yeah,
Gramsci.
You're not going to give up what you're doing.
No.
But for me, listening to you, the slightly terrifying thought about Jason Swan Clark, who came in from the cold, and could you just reflect on this, is the thing that marks you out from your childhood
Yeah.
is terrifyingly the ability, because I know you suffer mentally still from the effects of your childhood.
Yes,
your
I do.
ability to somehow take pain and push through pain. And what's that phrase about Christ? You know, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. There's a lot in Christianity which isn't very capitalist. You know, in fact, there was from a previous generation. There was a guy called Malcolm Muggeridge. He used to say, if St. Paul had gone to a PR consultant and said, "Look, I've got this new religion. The central image of it is a cross, you know, where they crucify people over a couple of days and they die agonizingly.
Yeah.
What do you think?" The PR consultant would say, "What are you thinking of?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, are you kind of set apart from not only from being, you know, genetically middle class or some miraculous way, but also having some capacity to push through pain that other people don't have?
Maybe I am. You know, I didn't grow up in a Christian family, and I've engaged in that, what I would call theologically the recapitulation of the Christ event, that it's normal to go to the cross. I mean, my evangelical tradition is one that's not very good on a theology of suffering. There are other Christian traditions that are much better at understanding suffering, which is why people often make the Anglo-Catholic route, because it's like, this doesn't work, it's not all triumphalistic. This is what Martin Luther said, you know, the Theologia Crucis, Theologia Gloria, that Christians like to bypass Good Friday and go straight to Easter Sunday. There was always that problem, you know, that's human nature.
Stations of the cross, which anchor you
and which we have to participate with. It's always been about participation. So fast forward to a world that does everything other, that we are more pain avoidant than ever and want to avoid participation. I mean, I've got some little side theories on the go at the minute. I'm thinking through epidemics and self-harm amongst young people. I think what's happening with young people around self-harm is to do with a lack of identity. So they've been overly parented, parents that try to all the statistics show and data rescue them, not go through suffering and pain, and they don't have resilience to deal with life, let alone Christian versions of it. But life is painful. At some point, something awful will happen to you. And if you haven't had a way to learn to process that and deal with it, we also have people there's no responsibility anymore that to you other than yourself. And actually, human beings are not made, and again, I'm a Christian, I believe that's the image we were made in God, and that's how we recover ourselves. We need to process our pain by participating with Christ. We need to be responsible, take on responsibilities. But we're not doing it, Christians aren't doing it, Christian parents aren't doing it. And they're wondering why with their kids, almost like my friend, you know, at their funeral, when life happens to them, there's nothing there other than anger, resentment, why has God let me down? Whereas that was not how Christians ever behaved in history, whose lives were far more, as we've talked about, short and brutal than ours, and yet were willing to give them up. I mean, they had nothing, and they were willing to, you know, sacrifice their lives immediately. We have these long, amazing lives that they couldn't imagine, and we won't do any sacrifice. As an aside, I think that's why people like Jordan Peterson at the minute, who I like a very lot. You know, there's a cultural phenomena. There's a clinical consultant, psychologist and lecturer and all things dark web and everything else about him. But he's got this message that people are going to listen to a philosopher talk for close to 2 hours non-stop and just listen to him. I mean, that's happened before existential philosophers and Sartre and others. But that's a manifestation in this is what gives me hope when I see that. He doesn't call himself a Christian, but he has a message with Christian values behind it, of Christian philosophy. But you hear him talk about the need to face pain and the need to take on responsibility. And I think he's tapping into, in his world and the way he talks it, something about we've lost something. And maybe is that part of a turning point? I don't know. But that's what we've got to recover. That you know, that if we want to be mature and emotionally mature, we need to. So here's another aside. You know, the mindfulness industry. There's now $1 billion industry of, and what people are starting to find is that it actually doesn't work, because you've separated. This is what commodification does. You've separated the practice from mindfulness. Used to be about differentiating from your feelings, noticing your thoughts and breathing, not so that you could deal with more crap in your life, but so that you could reconnect to what it meant to be a human being and virtue and goodness. Meditation's existed for thousands of years, but we come along, strip it away, put a little app to it. If I just do my breathing in and out, I don't attend to anything about how I'm living, my imagination for life, but I somehow think if I keep listening to these things, it will displace my anxiety. Well, you get temporary relief. But there's a big move at the minute, people are going, got to press under those meditations to the traditions that they come from, and there's whole ways of life. So again, maybe there's something going on there that people are getting to the end of.
Yeah, and sort of, we're not as people who master techniques were supposed to be refined. So, Jason, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you.
Thank you.
I know you're now taking on the baton, and you'll be interviewing people who, like yourself, haven't given up on their faith, and it's the thought that it will have an impact on society. So, thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.